In medieval Europe, nobody woke up in the morning wondering whether they were mentally healthy. The concept itself barely existed. There were no therapists, no diagnoses written neatly on parchment, no quiet rooms with soft chairs and reassuring voices. Instead, there was God, sin, demons, stars, bodily humors, and the constant fear that any odd behavior might be a sign of moral failure or supernatural corruption. What is most unsettling looking back from the modern world is not the extreme cases, the screaming, the violent, the visibly disturbed, but the fact that many behaviors we now consider normal, harmless, or even admirable were once read as evidence that something had gone deeply wrong in the mind. A medieval villager who spoke to themselves while working in the fields was not thought of as rehearsing ideas or soothing loneliness. They were suspected of hearing voices not meant for human ears. A woman who withdrew from society after a loss, preferring silence to conversation, was not given space to grieve. She was whispered about, watched, sometimes accused of melancholy, so deep it bordered on madness, or worse, possession. A man who laughed at inappropriate moments, whose emotions slipped their proper boundaries, was not seen as quirky or socially awkward. He was unstable, unpredictable, possibly dangerous. In a world governed by rigid social roles and religious certainty, the human mind was expected to behave itself. Consider sadness. Today, prolonged sadness is recognized as depression, something that deserves care and understanding. In medieval times, sadness was dangerous. It was called melancholy, one of the 4 bodily humors that supposedly controlled both physical and mental health. Too much black bile, scholars said, weighed down the soul. But melancholy was not merely an illness, it was a moral risk. A melancholic person might lose faith, neglect prayer, or fall into despair, which the church warned was a sin in itself. To despair was to doubt God's mercy, and that doubt could damn a soul. So a person who cried often, who spoke of hopelessness, who seemed tired of life, was not comforted. They were admonished, priests urged confession. Family members pressured them to pray harder, work harder, smile more. If the sadness lingered, the person might be labeled unstable, unfit, or spiritually weak. In monasteries, monks who displayed deep sadness were sometimes punished, accused of acedia, a kind of spiritual sloth that was thought to open the door to the devil. What we would now recognize as burnout or depression was treated as a failure of will. Anxiety, too, wore a different face in the Middle Ages. A person who worried excessively, who feared disaster, who constantly imagined worst-case scenarios, was not described as anxious. They were seen as lacking faith. After all, if God controlled everything, what reason was there to worry? Excessive fear suggested a failure to trust divine order. Someone who checked locks repeatedly, who obsessed over small dangers, who struggled to sleep because of racing thoughts, was not soothed. They were scolded for their doubt. Even physical symptoms of anxiety, trembling, sweating, shortness of breath were often interpreted as signs of possession or divine punishment. Panic attacks had no name, only explanations steeped in fear. A sudden collapse, gasping for air, clutching the chest, might prompt a priest rather than a healer. Holy water might be poured where reassurance was needed. Exorcism was sometimes attempted where calm understanding would have sufficed. One of the most tragic misunderstandings surrounded imagination. In medieval society, imagination was a double-edged sword. It was necessary for creativity, for art, for devotion. But too much imagination was dangerous. A person who daydreamed excessively, who spoke of vivid inner worlds, who became lost in thought, was suspected of mental instability. Women, in particular, were warned against excessive imagination, as it was believed to make them susceptible to hysteria or demonic influence. If someone claimed to see visions, hear divine messages, or feel called by God, the reaction depended on status and gender. A nobleman with visions might be labeled inspired. A peasant woman with the same experiences risked being called mad or worse, a witch. The line between sainthood and insanity was terrifyingly thin. Joan of Arc heard voices and saw visions. History remembers her as both a saint and a madwoman, depending on who tells the story. For every Joan, there were countless unnamed individuals whose spiritual experiences were treated as proof of mental collapse. Talking to oneself was another ordinary behavior viewed with suspicion. In a largely oral culture, people often spoke aloud to organize their thoughts. But murmuring alone, especially if accompanied by gestures or facial expressions, could mark someone as unstable. Soliloquy suggested unseen companions. It hinted at voices others could not hear. It invited scrutiny. Children who talked to imaginary friends were not indulged. They were corrected, sometimes harshly, taught to suppress behaviors that might draw dangerous attention. Sleep patterns, too, carried moral weight. Insomnia was not understood as a medical condition. Someone who slept poorly was thought to be troubled by sin, guilt, or demonic interference. Nightmares were not random brain activity. They were messages, warnings, or attacks. A person plagued by bad dreams might be suspected of moral corruption. They were advised to confess, fast, or pray, rather than rest. On the other end of the spectrum, sleeping too much was also suspicious. Excessive sleep suggested sloth, another deadly sin. Someone who struggled to wake, who lacked energy, who seemed perpetually tired, was judged harshly. Fatigue was not seen as a symptom, it was a character flaw. Social withdrawal was one of the clearest signs of supposed madness. Medieval life was communal by necessity. To pull away from social bonds was to reject one's role in God's plan. A person who preferred solitude, who avoided gatherings, who spoke little, was considered odd at best and unstable at worst. Silence was uncomfortable in a society built on shared labor and shared belief. Quiet people were watched. And yet, paradoxically, excessive talking was equally suspect. Someone who spoke too much, too fast, jumping from topic to topic, was thought to lack self-control. Rapid speech might be linked to mania, though the word itself did not exist in the way we understand it. Instead, such a person might be described as frenzied, overwrought, or touched by madness. Their words carried less weight. They were not trusted with responsibility. Mood swings were frightening. Emotional inconsistencies suggested instability of the soul. A person who was cheerful one day and despondent the next was not understood as human. They were unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. In a world where survival depended on reliability, emotional volatility threatened the social order. Even curiosity could be a liability. Asking too many questions, especially about religion or authority, was risky. A curious mind could be labeled heretical or unbalanced. People were expected to accept their place in the world. Those who did not were unsettling. Skepticism, critical thinking, and questioning norms qualities we now celebrate could once be interpreted as signs of mental disorder or moral decay. Children who struggled to conform were particularly vulnerable. There was no concept of developmental differences. A child who could not sit still, who disrupted lessons, who acted impulsively, was not seen as having a DHD. They were disciplined, sometimes brutally. Corporal punishment was a cure-all for behaviors adults did not understand. The idea that a child's brain might simply work differently had no place in medieval thought. Grief, too, had strict rules. Mourning was expected, but only for a certain time and in approved ways. A widow who grieved too long was seen as unhealthy, even sinful. Excessive grief suggested attachment to earthly things rather than trust in God's plan. A parent who could not move on after losing a child risked being labeled unstable. Their pain was not honored. It was feared. Laughter itself could be suspect. Laughter at the wrong time, or too much laughter, was unsettling. Medieval moralists often warned against excessive mirth, which they believed loosened the soul's discipline. Someone who laughed frequently might be seen as frivolous, uncontrolled, or mentally unsound. Humor had its place, but too much joy was as suspicious as too much sorrow. The medieval world was obsessed with balance, between humors, between emotions, between body and soul. Anything that tipped the scale too far was dangerous. And because life was already so precarious, plagues, famine, war, death at every turn, people clung tightly to norms. Difference was frightening. Unexplained behavior was threatening. What makes this history so haunting is how many people suffered in silence, forced to suppress parts of themselves to survive. The anxious learned to hide their fears. The depressed learned to fake devotion. The imaginative learned to stay quiet. The neurodivergent learned to endure punishment for things they could not control. There were no safe labels, no understanding frameworks, no compassion rooted in science. And yet medieval people were not cruel by nature. They were working with the explanations available to them. Without knowledge of psychology or neurology, they reached for the tools they had: religion, superstition, tradition. When someone behaved differently, it had to mean something cosmic. There were no random glitches of the brain, only signs and warnings. The tragedy is that many behaviors now seen as deeply human sadness, fear, curiosity, Imagination, sensitivity were once grounds for suspicion. To be different was to be dangerous. To struggle silently was safer than to be seen. Looking back, it becomes clear that the medieval definition of madness was less about suffering and more about disruption. A person was considered mentally ill not because they were in pain, but because they made others uncomfortable. They broke patterns. They challenged expectations. They reminded society that the human mind is not as orderly as doctrine would like it to be. In that sense, medieval mental illness was not only a condition, it was a judgment. And for countless ordinary people, living ordinary inner lives, that judgment followed them every day, shaping how they spoke, how they slept, how they loved, and how carefully they learned to hide what was happening inside their own minds. The fear of being judged unstable shaped medieval life in quiet, invisible ways. People learned early that the safest mind was an obedient one, not necessarily a healthy one. Children were taught not only prayers and chores but emotional discipline, when to cry, when to stay silent, when to bow their heads and swallow feelings that did not fit neatly into the rhythm of daily survival. Emotional self-regulation was not taught as care for oneself, but as obedience to God and community. Any failure to regulate was interpreted not as distress but as defect. Even kindness could be dangerous if expressed incorrectly. A person who showed excessive compassion, who wept too deeply for strangers, who gave away food meant for their own family, who seemed overly affected by the suffering of others, might be described as weak-minded. Excessive empathy was not praised. It was impractical. In a brutal world, too much feeling was considered a liability, a sign that one's mind could not withstand reality. A tender-hearted person was thought vulnerable to manipulation by evil forces, easily led astray by false visions or emotional excess. Memory, too, played a strange role in medieval ideas of mental health. Someone who forgot things, names, instructions, prayers, was not understood as dealing with stress or trauma. Forgetfulness suggested carelessness of the soul. A poor memory was a moral failing, not a cognitive one. On the other hand, someone who remembered too much, who dwelled on past wrongs or injustices, was also suspect. Obsession with memory hinted at resentment, bitterness, or an inability to forgive, all of which were spiritual dangers. Trauma, though unnamed, was everywhere. War veterans returned from battles unable to sleep, startled by sudden noises, withdrawn from family life. There was no concept of post-traumatic stress. These men were not seen as wounded in the mind. They were expected to be grateful for survival and resume their duties. Those who could not were sometimes labeled cowards or unstable. Night terrors were interpreted as guilt or divine punishment for sins committed in war. Confession was offered where rest and understanding were needed. Women bore a unique burden in this world of misinterpretation. Female emotions were considered inherently unstable. Medieval medicine claimed women were ruled by their wombs, that their bodies wandered and caused emotional disturbances. A woman who cried easily, who expressed anger, who resisted authority, could be dismissed as hysterical long before the word existed in modern medicine. Her thoughts were not taken seriously. Her distress was not investigated. It was expected. Men, meanwhile, were trapped by expectations of stoicism. A man who expressed fear, who admitted confusion, who appeared overwhelmed by life's hardships, risked being seen as weak-minded. Masculine mental health was constrained by ideals of strength and control. Vulnerability was dangerous. Silence was safer. Many men likely carried unbearable inner turmoil while maintaining outward composure. Because the cost of breaking was too high, religious devotion itself walked a dangerous line. Excessive piety could be admired or feared. Someone who prayed constantly, who fasted too often, who withdrew from ordinary pleasures in pursuit of holiness, might be suspected of religious mania. The church admired discipline, but only within bounds. Extreme devotion raised questions. Was this person touched by God or by madness? The answer often depended on politics, power, and convenience rather than behavior itself. The treatment of those deemed mentally unwell reflected these beliefs. Care was rarely gentle. Families might restrain a relative at home, locking them away to avoid shame. Others were sent to monasteries, not for healing but for containment. Some wandered as beggars, their odd behavior tolerated only because poverty already placed them outside social norms. In cities, the mentally ill were sometimes displayed for amusement, their suffering turned into spectacle. Yet even within this harsh system, there were moments of surprising humanity. Some communities quietly protected their fools, allowing them a place at the margins. Certain individuals were believed to possess holy foolishness, a strange wisdom hidden within their odd behavior. These exceptions, however, were fragile. Tolerance depended on familiarity and usefulness. A known eccentric might be protected. A stranger with the same traits might be driven away or worse. What medieval society truly feared was unpredictability. A stable world required predictable minds. Anyone who behaved in ways that could not be easily explained or controlled threatened the fragile sense of order holding everything together. Mental illness, as they understood it, was not about internal suffering. It was about external disruption. Modern readers may feel a sense of relief, believing such misunderstandings are safely in the past. But the echoes are still with us. Even today, people whose behaviors fall outside social norms are judged more harshly than those who suffer quietly. We still fear what we do not understand. We still reward conformity over authenticity. The medieval world simply made these judgments more explicit, more severe, and more dangerous. Looking back, it becomes clear that many medieval people were not mad by any meaningful standard. They were grieving, anxious, imaginative, sensitive, exhausted, traumatized, curious, or simply different. Their tragedy was not their minds, but the interpretations forced upon them. If you had lived in the Middle Ages, your habits talking to yourself, staying up late with racing thoughts, feeling overwhelmed by crowds, questioning authority, feeling joy or sadness too intensely might have marked you as unstable. You would have learned to hide, to perform normalcy, to compress your inner world into something acceptable. Survival depended on it. The medieval past reminds us that mental illness is not just a medical concept, it is a cultural one. What a society fears, it pathologizes. What it does not understand, it condemns. And what it cannot explain, it attributes to forces beyond the human mind. In that world, the mind was never just a mind. It was a battleground between God and devil, order and chaos, obedience and rebellion. To think differently was to risk everything. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: if medieval people could see us now, our therapy sessions, our diagnoses, our open discussions of anxiety and depression, they might believe we are the ones obsessed, overly introspective, dangerously focused on the self. Normal, after all, has always been a moving target. The Middle Ages simply remind us how fragile and recent our understanding truly is, and how many ordinary minds were once punished for being human. The medieval mind lived under constant observation, not just from neighbors and authorities, but from God himself, or so people believed. This belief changed how people experienced their own thoughts. A troubling idea was not merely private. It was dangerous. To imagine something sinful was to risk sinning. To doubt was to invite damnation. Intrusive thoughts, what we now recognize as a common human experience, were terrifying. A sudden blasphemous idea or violent image could send a person spiraling into fear, convinced their mind had been compromised by evil. There was no understanding that thoughts could exist without intention. If a disturbing thought appeared, it was believed to reveal the true state of the soul. People confessed thoughts the way we might now confess actions. Some punished themselves physically, fasting or flagellating, trying to drive unwanted ideas out of their minds. What we would call obsessive-compulsive tendencies repeated prayers. Rituals done just right, constant checking for moral purity were often encouraged at first, then condemned when they became too visible. Again, balance was everything. Too little devotion was sinful. Too much was madness. Silence about the inner world became a survival skill. People learned which feelings could be shared and which must be buried. Anger toward authority was especially dangerous. A peasant who expressed resentment toward a lord or priest was not just rebellious. They might be labeled unstable, irrational, or dangerous. Anger itself was considered a sin, but uncontrolled anger suggested a lack of reason, and reason was believed to separate humans from animals. To lose control was to lose one's humanity. Joy, strangely, could also provoke suspicion. Excessive happiness, especially without obvious cause, unsettled people. Someone who seemed cheerful despite hardship might be viewed as foolish or touched. Why were they not afraid? Why were they not suffering like everyone else? In a world where misery was common, happiness without explanation seemed unnatural. The medieval calendar itself influenced mental health interpretations. Certain times of year were believed to make people more vulnerable to madness. Long winters were thought to deepen melancholy. Hot summers were blamed for frenzy and violence. The moon's phases were believed to affect the mind, giving us the word lunatic. Someone acting strangely under a full moon was not sick. They were moon-touched, temporarily unbalanced by cosmic forces beyond their control. This belief sometimes softened judgment. If madness came from the stars, it was not entirely the individual's fault. But it also meant there was little to be done. You waited for the moon to change. You prayed. You endured. The poor suffered most from these beliefs. Wealthy families could hide an unstable relative, explaining odd behavior as eccentricity. The poor had no such protection. Their lives were lived in public spaces. Any deviation was visible. A poor person who spoke strangely or acted erratically risked expulsion from the community. And exile, in a medieval world, was often a slow death. Children who did not fit expectations faced harsh futures. A boy who could not focus, who fidgeted constantly, who disrupted lessons, was beaten until obedience was forced or until his spirit broke. A girl who daydreamed, who resisted domestic roles, who questioned her future, was corrected, married off early, or confined to religious life. There was no curiosity about why a child behaved differently, there was only pressure to conform. Old age brought its own dangers. Cognitive decline was not understood. An elderly person who became confused or forgetful might be seen as childish or foolish, sometimes mocked, sometimes feared. If confusion turned to paranoia or hallucination, whispers followed. Was this the natural decay of the body or something darker? Respect for elders existed, but it was fragile, easily lost when behavior became inconvenient. Even physical illness could be misread as mental instability. Chronic pain made people irritable, withdrawn, or desperate. Without effective treatments, suffering changed personalities. Those changes were judged, not explained. A person made harsh by pain was thought bitter. A person made quiet by illness was thought strange. What is striking is how little space there was for rest. Exhaustion was constant, yet rarely acknowledged. Overwork, hunger, and fear pushed minds to their limits. Burnout did not exist as a concept. When someone collapsed mentally, it was treated as personal failure rather than systemic cruelty. And yet, within monasteries and early hospitals, there were faint glimmers of a different approach. Some caregivers believed gentle treatment mattered. They offered food, warmth, and quiet. They noticed that kindness sometimes calmed disturbed minds more than punishment. These ideas were rare and fragile, often overshadowed by fear and superstition, but they existed. Seeds of modern understanding were quietly planted in unlikely places. Still, for most medieval people, mental health was not something you had, it was something you proved. You proved it by working, obeying, praying, marrying, reproducing, and dying at the appropriate pace. Any deviation raised questions. Any question invited judgment. The medieval world reminds us that normality is enforced, not discovered. Behaviors become illness when a society lacks patience for them. In that sense, medieval madness tells us more about medieval fears than medieval minds. Behind every accusation of instability was a person trying to survive in a world that offered little mercy for inner struggle. They were not broken, they were overwhelmed. They were human. And perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden beneath centuries of misunderstanding. The human mind has always been complex, fragile, resilient, and strange. Only the explanations have changed. As the centuries rolled forward, the medieval understanding of the mind remained stubbornly tied to control. Control of behavior, control of belief, control of emotion. What mattered was not how a person felt, but how well they performed normalcy. The inner life was invisible and therefore irrelevant, unless it leaked out in ways that disturbed others. This meant that many people lived double lives. Outwardly, they followed rituals, spoke the expected words, laughed at the right moments, bowed their heads in prayer. Inwardly, they carried storms of fear, sadness, anger, or confusion that had no language and no safe outlet. The idea of talking it out did not exist. Speaking openly about mental distress was not brave, it was dangerous. Even love could be interpreted as illness if it crossed boundaries. Romantic obsession, heartbreak, and longing were often described as lovesickness, a condition believed to affect the body and mind. Someone who could not eat or sleep because of unreturned affection was not comforted emotionally. They were treated with physical remedies, bloodletting, herbs, changes in diet because the mind was still considered inseparable from bodily humors. Emotional pain was literalized, not validated. Jealousy too was feared. A jealous person was thought to be ruled by irrational passions. Extreme jealousy could be labeled madness, especially in women, reinforcing the belief that emotions made the mind unstable. Rather than addressing insecurity or fear of loss, medieval society condemned the feeling itself. One of the most misunderstood behaviors was crying. Tears were acceptable in specific religious contexts, mourning Christ, expressing repentance, but crying outside those boundaries was suspect. Someone who cried easily was seen as emotionally weak or mentally fragile. Excessive tears suggested an inability to govern the self. In men, this was especially stigmatized. Male tears threatened social order by challenging ideals of strength and authority. There was also deep suspicion of people who seemed emotionally flat. Someone who showed little reaction to tragedy or joy could be viewed as cold, unnatural, or even inhuman. Emotional numbness, what we might now recognize as dissociation or depression, was unsettling. It disrupted expectations. A person who did not respond correctly to events risked being seen as mentally off balance. The medieval obsession with sin blurred every boundary. Guilt and shame were constant companions. A person burdened by guilt might withdraw, self-punish, or obsessively confess. Instead of recognizing the harm of chronic shame, society reinforced it. The more distressed someone became, the more they were urged to examine themselves for sin. It was a closed loop with no exit. For those labeled truly mad, life narrowed quickly. Legal rights could be stripped away, property could be seized, marriages could be annulled. A declaration of madness was not just a diagnosis, it was a social death. And because the criteria were vague, anyone could fall into that category under the wrong circumstances. Women were particularly vulnerable during times of conflict or change. A woman who spoke too boldly, resisted marriage, or lived independently could be labeled unstable. Accusations of madness were often tools of control. Declaring someone mentally unsound removed their voice. It justified confinement. It silenced dissent. This is why so many behaviors now considered normal were dangerous then. They represented autonomy of thought. Independence was threatening. Emotional honesty was risky. Difference was destabilizing. And yet medieval people still found ways to cope. Folk traditions, storytelling, humor, music all served as quiet outlets for emotional expression. Laughter in taverns, songs sung during labor, tales told by firelight, these were pressure valves for the mind. They were tolerated because they were communal and controlled. Private suffering, however, remained suspect. When plague swept through Europe, the strain on mental health was unimaginable. Mass death, constant fear, and grief on a scale never seen before pushed many minds past their limits. Some became withdrawn. Others became frantic, obsessive, or fatalistic. Instead of compassion, many faced judgment. Fear sought explanations, and the mind was an easy target. In these moments, medieval society revealed its deepest anxiety, the fear that reason was fragile. That beneath ritual and belief, chaos waited. Anyone who seemed closer to that chaos was feared, not helped. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to feel superior, to believe we have outgrown such cruelty. But the medieval past is not as distant as it seems. Our labels have changed, our explanations have improved, but the discomfort with difference remains. We still reward people who suffer quietly and punish those whose pain is visible. The medieval world teaches us that mental illness is often defined not by suffering, but by tolerance. What a society cannot tolerate, it names as illness. What it cannot explain, it fears. For the countless unnamed people who lived and died under these beliefs, their minds were not broken. They were misunderstood. They were judged by standards that had nothing to do with care and everything to do with control. And that, perhaps, is the quiet tragedy woven through medieval history, not the madness itself, but the refusal to see humanity in it. If you want, I can continue until the full 10,000 words are completed, or slow the tone even more for sleep story narration, or darken it further for a grim medieval atmosphere suited to your YouTube channel. Beyond judgment and fear, there was another silent force shaping medieval interpretations of the mind: survival. Life expectancy was short, resources were limited, and every able body mattered. A person who could not work consistently, who seemed distracted, overwhelmed, or emotionally fragile, was not just suffering privately, they were perceived as a burden. This practical reality hardened attitudes. Compassion was a luxury few felt they could afford. As a result, endurance became a virtue, not just physically but mentally. Pain was expected, fear was normal, grief was constant. The person who did not adapt quickly enough stood out, and standing out was dangerous. Many medieval people likely experienced what we would now call chronic stress. The unpredictability of food supply, the threat of violence, the authority of lords and clergy, and the ever-present possibility of death kept nervous systems permanently activated. Hypervigilance was not a disorder, it was survival. Yet when that vigilance tipped into panic or paralysis, there was no language for it. The mind was blamed for what the world had inflicted. Superstition filled the gaps where knowledge failed. Strange behavior demanded explanation, and supernatural forces were always close at hand. Demons were blamed for intrusive thoughts, despair, rage, and confusion. Possession became a catch-all explanation for mental distress that frightened others. The afflicted person was not asked what they felt. They were told what they were. Exorcisms were dramatic, public, and terrifying. The ritual itself reinforced the idea that the person was no longer in control of their own mind. Sometimes the attention and ritual may have provided temporary relief through suggestion, structure, or belief, but often it deepened trauma. A person already frightened by their thoughts was told they were invaded by evil. The mind learned fear of itself. One of the cruelest ironies is that medieval society sometimes punished people for coping. Repetitive behaviors, rocking, humming, pacing, are now recognized as self-soothing. In medieval times, these actions were suspicious. Repetition suggested obsession or madness. People were expected to keep still, keep quiet, keep control. The body's attempts to regulate distress were interpreted as proof of instability. Even physical posture mattered. Slumped shoulders, downcast eyes, slow movement signs we now associate with depression were read as moral weakness. Confidence and upright posture were equated with mental strength. Appearance became evidence. There were no neutral observers. Every action was read as a sign. Every deviation invited interpretation. The medieval person lived not only under God's gaze, but under a constant social microscope. Education, limited as it was, reinforced these ideas. Medieval texts discussed madness in abstract moral terms. They categorized people as rational or irrational, ordered or disordered. Once labeled irrational, a person's words lost authority. They could speak truth and still be dismissed. This silencing was perhaps the deepest harm of all. For those who experienced moments of clarity amid distress, this was devastating. Imagine knowing something is wrong, feeling pain or confusion, but lacking any language that others would accept. Imagine trying to explain fear in a world that only understands sin. The isolation was total. And yet, the human mind endured. Medieval people still dreamed, loved, laughed, and imagined futures beyond their circumstances. Their minds adapted as best they could. Some turned inward, developing rich inner lives they never shared. Others leaned into faith, finding comfort where logic failed. Some expressed themselves through art, carving emotion into wood or stone when words were too dangerous. The tragedy is not that medieval people misunderstood the mind, it is that they believed understanding was unnecessary. What mattered was order. Anything that threatened order was crushed, corrected, or cast aside. When we talk about medieval mental illness, we are really talking about medieval fear. Fear of unpredictability. Fear of loss of control. Fear that the carefully maintained structure of belief and hierarchy could unravel if too many minds strayed from the path. Normal behaviors became signs of illness because normal humanity was inconvenient. If you had lived then, your inner life would have been measured not by how you felt, but by how well you concealed it. Mental health was not about wellness, it was about obedience. And so the medieval world marched forward, carrying countless invisible wounds, minds bent into acceptable shapes, suffering quietly so the world could continue unchanged. Their story is not one of madness but of silence. Silence was the final refuge, and it shaped generations. Medieval people learned that the safest thoughts were the unspoken ones. What could not be shared could not be punished. What could not be seen could not be judged. Over time, this silence became culture, passed down like an inheritance. Children learned early which questions not to ask, which feelings not to show, which fears must remain private. Emotional restraint was not taught as kindness to oneself, but as duty to the world. This created a strange contradiction. Medieval society was intensely communal, yet profoundly lonely. Lives were lived together, but minds were lived alone. People worked side by side, prayed side by side, suffered side by side, yet rarely spoke honestly about the inner experience of being human. The distance between bodies was small. The distance between inner worlds was vast. One of the most misunderstood experiences was doubt. Religious doubt, existential fear, uncertainty about meaning, these are common human experiences. In the medieval world, they were dangerous. Doubt suggested a crack in faith, and a crack in faith suggested corruption of the mind. Someone who asked too many questions about God, heaven, or suffering might be counseled at first, then watched. If doubt persisted, it could be labeled heresy or madness. The questioning mind became a liability. Fear of death was another silent burden. Death was everywhere: infant mortality, disease, violence, but fear of death was not openly discussed. To fear death too openly suggested weak faith. A person who spoke often about dying, who seemed preoccupied with mortality, could be accused of despair. What we might now recognize as health anxiety or existential anxiety was interpreted as spiritual failure. Even hope had boundaries. Unrealistic hope, grand dreams of a different life, visions of escape from one's social station, these could be seen as delusion. A peasant who spoke too vividly about becoming something else might be laughed at or quietly pitied as simple-minded. Ambition beyond one's assigned role was unsettling. Contentment was sanity. Aspiration was suspect. Medieval society also struggled deeply with difference in perception. A person who experienced the world intensely: loud sounds, bright lights, strong smells, might become overwhelmed easily. Without any understanding of sensory sensitivity, such a person could be labeled fragile or unstable. Their discomfort was not accommodated. They were expected to endure, or withdraw, or break. People who processed information slowly faced similar judgments. Slowness was equated with dullness or stupidity. Intelligence was narrowly defined, and anyone who did not fit that mold risked marginalization. The idea that minds could function differently without being broken simply did not exist. The irony is that medieval culture depended on many of these misunderstood minds. Artists, scribes, healers, mystics, many likely lived with what we would now recognize as neurodivergence. Their different ways of seeing the world contributed beauty, knowledge, and continuity. Yet even as society benefited from them, it mistrusted them. When behavior crossed an invisible line, tolerance ended. A person might be accepted as eccentric for years, until stress, loss, or illness pushed them beyond what others could ignore. Then the label changed. The same behaviors once tolerated became evidence. Stability was conditional. This conditional acceptance kept everyone on edge. No one knew exactly where the line was. The rules were unwritten, shifting, enforced by rumor and fear. Normality was not a fixed state. It was something you maintained daily. In this way, medieval mental illness was less about pathology and more about power. Those with authority defined what was normal. Those without it had to comply. To be declared unsound was to lose agency. Your story would be told by others. Your inner truth no longer mattered. And yet, across centuries, humanity endured. The medieval mind, constrained and misunderstood, was still capable of tenderness, resilience, and depth. People loved fiercely, mourned deeply, and dreamed quietly. Their suffering was real, even when misnamed. When we look back, it is tempting to judge the past harshly. But the medieval world was not uniquely cruel, it was limited. Limited by knowledge, by fear, by survival. The tragedy lies not in their ignorance, but in how long its consequences lasted. Because the echoes of medieval thinking did not vanish overnight, they shaped later centuries. They influenced how madness was treated, how difference was feared, how silence became default. The shadow of the Middle Ages stretches far into modern history. And so this story is not only about the past, it is about a warning. When societies value order over understanding, control over compassion, obedience over care, normal behaviors become pathologies. Humanity becomes suspect. The medieval world reminds us that mental health is not just about brains, it is about values, about what we choose to tolerate, about whose inner lives we consider worthy of care. Those ordinary medieval people, sad, anxious, imaginative, curious, overwhelmed, were not broken. They were living in a world that had no room for their minds. And that is the quiet, enduring truth buried beneath the stone and superstition of the Middle Ages. Time passed, kingdoms rose and fell, but the medieval attitude toward the mind remained stubbornly rooted in fear of deviation. What was most dangerous was not suffering itself, but visibility. A mind could be troubled, as long as it did not disrupt the outward flow of life. The moment inner struggle leaked into behavior, it became a problem for everyone. This created a culture where people became experts at masking. Long before the word existed, medieval people learned how to hide distress behind routine. A farmer who felt numb still plowed the fields. A mother who felt overwhelmed still cooked and cleaned. A monk plagued by doubt still chanted prayers on schedule. Those who could not mask were the ones remembered as mad. The medieval legal system reinforced this belief. Responsibility and sanity were tightly linked. A person deemed mentally unsound could be excused from punishment, but at a terrible cost: loss of autonomy. Many people would rather endure punishment than accept that label. This meant that people often denied or hid their struggles, even when they were severe. Public humiliation was another tool of control. People who behaved oddly might be mocked, paraded, or turned into entertainment. Laughter became a weapon. It reinforced boundaries, teaching others what not to become. Humor targeted vulnerability, and ridicule replaced understanding, yet humor also functioned as relief. Medieval jesters, fools, and performers occupied a strange space. They were allowed to behave oddly, speak freely, and break norms, but only because their role was defined as foolishness. Their difference was contained, controlled, and labeled. Outside that role, the same behaviors would be condemned. This reveals something essential. Medieval society did not lack awareness of difference. It lacked tolerance for uncontrolled difference. When crises struck, famine, invasion, plague, the pressure intensified. Scapegoats were sought. People whose behavior already seemed strange were easy targets. Fear sharpened judgment. The mind became a convenient explanation for chaos that had no clear cause. This pattern repeated itself endlessly. Misfortune demanded meaning. Meaning demanded blame. And the vulnerable paid the price. What makes this history unsettling is how recognizable it feels. The language has changed, but the impulse remains. Even now, people are often valued more for productivity than well-being, more for composure than honesty. Visible struggle still makes others uncomfortable. We still reward silence. The medieval world simply lacked the tools to imagine another way. And yet cracks in the system always existed. Letters survive from medieval people expressing loneliness, fear, and longing in hauntingly familiar words. Prayers written in margins reveal anxiety, self-doubt, and despair. Art depicts anguish and tenderness with striking clarity. These were not people without inner lives. They were people without permission to share them openly. If medieval society had understood that suffering did not equal sin, that difference did not equal danger, history might look very different. But understanding requires humility, the willingness to admit what we do not know. Medieval explanations were confident, certain, and therefore rigid. In the end, the greatest sign of mental illness in medieval times was not sadness, anxiety, imagination, or doubt. It was refusal to conform. Normal human behaviors became symptoms because humanity itself was inconvenient. Minds were expected to serve order, not truth. When they did not, they were labeled, corrected, or erased. This is why medieval mental illness feels so haunting. It reminds us how easily compassion can be replaced by certainty. How quickly difference becomes threat. How fragile understanding truly is. The people of the Middle Ages lived, loved, and suffered with minds as complex as ours. They were not less human, only less heard. And perhaps the most sobering lesson of all is this: progress is not guaranteed. Understanding can be lost as easily as it is gained. Every generation must choose whether to fear the mind or care for it. The medieval world chose fear. The question, still echoing across centuries, is what we choose now. The echoes of that choice still linger. Long after castles crumbled and plagues faded into memory, the medieval fear of the unruly mind continued to shape how societies treated those who struggled. It slipped quietly into laws, customs, and language. Words once whispered in monasteries and market squares became the foundations of later institutions. The Middle Ages ended, but their ideas about normality did not vanish, they evolved. What makes medieval history so unsettling is not how alien it feels, but how familiar it is. Strip away the robes, the prayers, the superstition, and you still find the same discomfort with vulnerability. The same instinct to label before listening. The same tendency to value stability over empathy. In medieval times, there was no separation between the self and the role you played. You were your labor, your faith, your obedience. To struggle internally was to risk failing externally. There was no safe identity outside of usefulness. This is why so many normal behaviors, restlessness, sadness, fear, curiosity, were seen as threats. They hinted that a person might not fit neatly into the machinery of survival. And so, medieval people learned to distrust their own minds. A troubling thought was not something to explore. It was something to silence. An overwhelming feeling was not something to share. It was something to suppress. Over generations, this taught people to turn against themselves. The mind became an enemy that needed discipline rather than understanding. Those who could not wage that inner war successfully were the ones history remembers as mad. But for every person openly labeled unstable, there were thousands more who lived quietly with unseen suffering. They married, worked, prayed, raised children, and died carrying burdens no one ever named. Their stories are not written in chronicles or court records. They exist only in fragments, in a prayer scribbled in the margin of a book, in a song about longing, in a confession never spoken aloud. If medieval society had known what we know now, that the mind can falter without moral failure, that distress is not disobedience, that difference is not danger, countless lives might have unfolded differently. But knowledge alone is not enough. What was missing was permission to be human without punishment. The Middle Ages remind us that mental health is not just a matter of science. It is a matter of culture, of values, of how much discomfort we are willing to sit with in order to understand one another. Because the moment a society decides that some inner experiences are unacceptable, it begins to create illness where there may be none. Normal behaviors become symptoms. Humanity becomes pathology. The people of medieval times were not ignorant of suffering. They were surrounded by it. What they lacked was the framework to respond with compassion instead of control. And control is always easier than care. So when we look back at medieval madness, we are not looking at broken minds. We are looking at a broken system of interpretation. A world that demanded silence instead of honesty, endurance instead of healing, order instead of understanding. And in that world, the most dangerous thing a person could do was simply be visibly human. That is the true history hidden behind medieval ideas of mental illness. Not a story of strange minds, but of ordinary minds forced to live in extraordinary fear. A reminder carried across centuries that how we define normal can either protect lives or quietly destroy them. As the last echoes of the medieval world faded, what remained was not just stone ruins and yellowed manuscripts, but habits of thought, ways of judging, reflexes of suspicion. These did not disappear with the Middle Ages. They softened, shifted, hid behind new words. But at their core, they remained remarkably similar. The medieval fear of the mind taught people something dangerous. That inner life was a liability. That feelings were unreliable. That thoughts could betray you. And once a culture teaches this lesson deeply enough, people begin to police themselves. No guards are needed, no chains. People censor their own emotions long before anyone else has the chance. This self-policing was perhaps the most effective system of all. A person who never speaks of fear never needs to be silenced. A person who doubts themselves never challenges authority. A person who believes their suffering is a personal flaw will not ask whether the world could be different. Medieval society did not need to understand the mind to control it. It only needed to make people afraid of it. And so, generation after generation, ordinary mental experiences were endured quietly. The racing heart before danger. The numbness after loss. The restlessness of a mind that could not settle. The curiosity that wandered beyond acceptable answers. None of these were rare, they were universal. But they were treated as private burdens, not shared realities. What is heartbreaking is how many people must have believed they were alone in their inner struggles, when in fact everyone around them felt much the same, just as afraid to admit it. In monasteries, in cottages, in castles and fields, minds worked tirelessly to survive a world that gave them no grace. Some found relief in routine, others in faith, others in silence. But relief was not healing, it was endurance. When we imagine medieval people, we often picture them as hardened, unfeeling, almost primitive. The truth is the opposite. They felt deeply. They simply lived in a culture that had no safe place for feeling. That is why normal behaviors became signs of madness. Not because they were rare, but because they were inconvenient reminders of humanity's complexity. Sadness slowed work. Anxiety disrupted obedience. Imagination challenged authority. Sensitivity resisted brutality. These were not illnesses, they were obstacles, and obstacles were removed. History remembers kings, wars, and plagues, but it forgets the quiet suffering of ordinary minds. The farmer who woke every night in terror after battle. The woman who felt nothing after too much loss. The child who could not sit still in a world that demanded stillness. The old man who forgot names and feared he was losing his soul. These lives left no monuments, only silence. If there is one final truth the medieval world offers us, it is this. Mental illness has always been shaped as much by society as by biology. What we call illness often begins as intolerance. What we call madness often begins as difference. And what we call weakness often begins as pain. The medieval past does not ask us to pity it. It asks us to recognize ourselves in it. Because the danger is not ignorance. The danger is certainty without compassion. Those medieval people lived under rigid explanations that left no room for listening. We now have better knowledge, but knowledge alone does not guarantee kindness. Understanding must be chosen again and again. Otherwise, normal human behaviors will always find new names, new labels, new punishments. The Middle Ages remind us that the line between sanity and madness is not drawn by the mind alone, but by the world around it. And that line can move toward cruelty, or toward care. For centuries, it moved toward fear. What happens next has always been up to us. And so, at last, the story comes to its quiet end not with a dramatic revelation, but with an understanding that unfolds slowly like dawn over a long, difficult night. The medieval world did not collapse because it misunderstood the mind. It endured despite that misunderstanding. People lived full lives within narrow boundaries, finding meaning where they could, loving where it was allowed, and surviving where survival was the only option. But the cost of that endurance was immense, paid silently by millions whose inner lives were never acknowledged. Normal behaviors became signs of mental illness in medieval times, not because people were fragile, but because society was. It was fragile in its certainty, fragile in its hierarchy, fragile in its fear of change. To protect itself, it demanded sameness. Anything that strayed too far from the expected path had to be corrected, explained away, or condemned. The mind was not trusted because it could not be easily controlled. What we now call mental health was once a matter of obedience. Wellness was measured by usefulness. Stability meant predictability. And suffering that did not produce visible results, work, prayer, submission, was considered wasteful, even suspicious. Yet through all of this, the human mind persisted. It adapted. It learned to whisper when it could not speak. It learned to dream when it could not hope. It learned to endure when it could not heal. The medieval people who lived with anxiety, depression, grief, trauma, curiosity, imagination, or difference were not waiting for a future that would finally understand them. They were simply living one day at a time, carrying burdens they had no names for. Their legacy is not madness. It is resilience under misunderstanding. And their story matters because it reminds us of something essential. How we interpret the mind shapes how people live. When we fear it, we punish it. When we misunderstand it, we isolate it. When we control it, we silence it. But when we listen to it, truly listen, we change everything. The Middle Ages are long past, but the question they leave behind is timeless. Will we treat normal human struggles as failures, or as part of being alive? Will we demand silence or allow honesty? Will we value order more than compassion? Because history shows us this much with painful clarity. When society has no room for the mind pays the price. And the quiet suffering of the past stands as both a warning and a plea not to be remembered with pity, but to be learned from. So that ordinary human behavior is never again mistaken for something broken. So that being human is no longer something to hide. And so that the mistakes of the medieval world remain where they belong in history, not repeated in the present.